So in this tutorial we're going to look at creating animations in Creo 6, and what we're looking at currently on the screen here is the animation toolbar and the animation interface. So we've got a timeline at the top of the screen here, which has got the number of seconds indicated at the bottom, and then we've got various events happening at various points within that timeline. So you can see I'm indicating some of the assembly explode events on this bottom events line, and then we've got changing of views, so the view direction changes as this animation plays through, and then we've got some changes to the display of certain parts. So certain parts become semi-transparent and then return to full opacity. So if you want to see what this particular setup creates, here's the MPEG file which was saved out of Creo once the animation had been set up. And if I just set this playing now, so you can see this is an assembly. The assembly explodes. The view angle rotates slightly, then it pauses. You can already see the outer casing is becoming slightly transparent there, just to aid in your view of any of the other parts. The view changes again, and then you can see the assembly coming back together again. Now the two end pieces of the casing are still transparent. You can see them gradually transitioning back to opaque now. And then there's a single part move there, just to illustrate that you can do individual part moves as well as an overall explode as well. So that's essentially what we're going to look at, how you would create that sort of animation. We may not 100% replicate the one that we were looking at there, but we've got that for reference. So that is already saved within our Creo assembly as animation 1. So you can see that there. So the first thing that we're going to address is how do you create an exploded view state. So this is a little bit of functionality which is technically not part of animation, although we are going to use this in our animation. So before you get into the animation setup itself, you want to go into the View tab there. And within the View tab, the View Manager sits sort of central on the ribbon on the top of the screen there. So if you click on the View Manager, there it is in the drop down list. And this allows you to manage not only the direction with which the camera is viewing the model from, but it allows you to define exploded views of an assembly. So you can see we've got two current exploded views in there that I've created already, and if you want to activate an exploded view, you can just double click on it, and you can see the view window now updates with the assembly in that exploded position. And there's an exploded number 2 there, which if I click on that, that was what I was using to drive the end portion of our animation, where this front cap just moved forward and then returned to its original position. So if you want to create a new exploded view, so the first thing I'm going to do is switch this exploded view off. So if I right click on there and untick the explode option, then that turns that exploded view off. It goes back to just standard view with the assembly fully assembled. If I want to then create a new exploded view, as if you were coming in into a fresh assembly here that didn't have any exploded views, you go into the Explode tab in View Manager, click on New. The system will give it a default name. If you're happy with that, you can just stick with the default name and just press Enter there and accept that. And then what we're going to do is we're going to edit the positions of these components into their exploded positions. So if you click on the Edit tab there, that will open a drop down, and then if you click on Edit Position, now what happens here is you can select a component. So if I select that component there, you get your 3-axis drag handle that you can drag the component in any one of the 3 directions, and then select another component and drag that component out to wherever I need it to be. So you can see you gradually build up the positions that you'd like the parts in when they're in their exploded state, just by clicking and dragging. And I think that's okay for us. So when you're happy with the positions of those parts, you can always go back in and tweak them slightly. But let's say I'm reasonably happy with how that looks now. I then click on OK. So I OK that exploded view. And then you want to go into the Edit drop down there and click on Save. Now if you don't do that, this exploded view will be lost. So you've got to do that. Click on Save. And make sure that this tick box is selected. Now what this allows you to do, if I wanted to save the direction that the camera is viewing this exploded view from, I could tick this top box here as well. In this case I don't want to save the orientation. I want to handle the orientation of the camera separately to its exploded state, so I want to make sure that's not selected. The only thing I want to save about this view is the positions of my exploded components. So this is the only tick box that I want to have selected. So I click on OK there, and that view is now saved. And I can sort of check that by, if I activate one of the other exploded views by double clicking and then reactivate my new exploded view, you can see that it is actually saved. The components do return to the positions that I put them in. So that's good. So we've set up our exploded view. So we can close that now. Now let's say we didn't have an animation tab already open. The way that you would activate a new animation would be clicking on Applications there and then clicking on the Animations button, and you'll be transported into that animation tab. So once you've clicked on Animation and you're in the Animations tab, what will happen by default is you will be given an initial animation setup there called Animation 1, and your components will be in whatever position you left them in when you were in your View Manager. Now as I've already said, we already have an Animation 1, and if we play that back we can see that it's the animation that generated that MPEG file that we were looking at earlier. So you've got to imagine that we don't already have this animation created. So I'm just going to stop the generation of that. So I'm going to create a fresh animation here, and I'm going to call it Animation 2. Now what you might like to do is start your animation off as just a static explode. So that's one where the camera view is not moving, the transparency of the components is not changing throughout the animation. All you're asking the system to do is to explode the parts from their fully assembled position to their exploded positions, and then maybe back again. So that's a good starting point for what we want to achieve. So click on Explode Animation. The system's now asking me, what do you want to call this new animation? Animation 2 is fine. And now we're in there, and you can see we have a blank timeline. So what I'm going to do first, I'm going to create an animation, manage keyframe sequence. Now when you click on keyframe sequence there, essentially what we're going to do is we're going to mark certain points in our timeline and tell the system how we'd like the explode state of the model to be at those points in time. So initially I want my model to be unexploded, and I want that to happen at 0 seconds. So initially in the timeline it's an unexploded model. So if I'm happy with that, I click on the little plus icon here, and you can see that gets entered into the timeline. You can see it's also popped up here on the graphical representation of my timeline. Then let's say I decide at 10 seconds I want the model to be fully exploded. So I'm going to pick my exploded view there, EXP0003, and I want that to occur at 10 seconds. So I'm just going to put 10 seconds in again. Click on plus, and you can see what the system does is it's got its initial explode state down here, which is the unexploded view, and then by 10 seconds on my timeline the view is fully exploded, and it's showing me what that would look like at 10 seconds. So we'll quickly just OK that and check that we understand what's happening there. So click on OK. Then you want to have the create button, because we're still creating this timeline. We've not yet finished it and we want to play it back. So if you click on the generate button here, which looks confusingly like a little play button, click on generate. The system will figure out all the intervening steps between fully unexploded and then fully exploded. So initially it doesn't know what the model will look like in all those intervening steps, so it has to generate that information. So that's what you're doing when you click on the generate key. You're generating the interpolation between unexploded and exploded. So that's okay. So let's get back in there and add some more explode steps in. So probably the easiest way to do that is if you select the timeline that's been generated for those exploded steps and right click on it and go edit keyframe sequence, so edit KFS. Then you come back into this dialog that we were just in before. So let's see if the system will let us add a further explode at 20 seconds. Yes, it will. So basically the system is, the model is going to go from unexploded to exploded in the first 10 seconds. Then it's going to sit fully exploded for a further 10 seconds to take it to 20. And then I think we'll bring it back together again, maybe by 30 seconds. So let's say we'd like it unexploded by 30 seconds. Yes, add that. And I think what we'll also do is the movement of these components can be at a constant velocity, which is what we've got this set on at the moment. That's linear translation. It often produces a nicer looking animation, a more professional looking animation, if you change that across to smooth. So as the model explodes, the parts will accelerate away smoothly and then decelerate as they slow down. So it gives them a more realistic feel, as if they have actual mass to them. So we'll click on OK there. We'll generate the keyframe sequence again. So even though we've put more explode steps in our animation, they've gone beyond our current limit for our timeline. So our current limit is 10 seconds. So if we put 30 in there and press enter, you can see that we can now see those other keyframe points that we created. So your timeline needs extending up. Its default length is 10 seconds, and the system will allow you to add keyframes beyond the default length, but you won't be able to view them unless you extend the timeline itself to cover those keyframes. So that's what I did there. I expanded the timeline from 10 seconds up to 30 seconds just by entering 30 and then pressing enter. So let's do a generate now. Every time that I regenerate these in-between frames, the system gives me a little warning saying you're about to get rid of the frames that you generated last time. I'm just saying OK because I understand that that's a risk, but I understand that I'm going to regenerate those intervening frames, so I'm OK with that. So now you can see what we've got essentially there is it starts unexploded, it takes 10 seconds to explode, it sits in its unexploded state for a period of time, another 10 seconds, and then it comes back together again. So that's a reasonable basis for what we're trying to achieve. If you remember back to the MPEG, the thing explodes initially, and then it sits in its exploded state to let the camera rotate around and view it from various different angles. So let's address the camera angles that we can transition between in this animation. So again, there's a little pre-step that we have to do before we can put those camera change points in our timeline. And again, we have to go back into the View tab. So, and again, we have to go back into the View Manager. It's just that this time we're not working in the Explode tab, we're working in the Orient tab. So that's the orientation of the camera. And you can see there's all your default orientations, so your back and bottom and front and left and right and top, and then there's the default isometric, and I've actually added in some extra ones here that are used in that original animation. We're now going to create some new ones, but if we just activate these 1, 2, 3 and 4 that I've already created, just to see what sort of angles I created in there. So double click on 1, so that's the sort of initial angle for the animation. Double click on 2, that is one of the transition points, sort of halfway through the original animation. 3, again, it's rotating it round to view a different angle of the part. And then 4, it's zooming out slightly. So if we want to create a new view, again, you just click on New at the top here, New. We're now on View 5. So I'll press Enter if I'm happy with that name. You can name it whatever you need to keep track of these views. And then what I would do is I would then navigate the camera to the angle that I wanted for that view. So let's say I wanted that sort of angle and zoomed in by about that much. So let's say I was happy with that. Then I go into the Edit menu again, click on Save. And this time I don't want to save any information about whether this thing is exploded or unexploded. I've already got control of that in my exploded views, my saved exploded views. So I can deselect whether it's exploded or unexploded. That's not what I'm interested in here. The only thing I'm interested in is the orientation of the camera. So I want to make sure that this one is selected at the top. So now it's going to save the orientation of the camera as it is currently under the name View 5. So that is what I want to do in this particular case. So click on OK there. Let's create a few more views. So let's do another one, View 6. Press Enter. I think maybe we'll zoom in slightly with this one and sort of rotate round so we're viewing from the underside, as I would call it. And then again we go into Edit and Save. We don't want to save the exploded state of this thing. We only want to save the camera orientation. So make sure you do that step, because if you don't, what is going to happen is when you call this view up in your timeline, it's going to overrule the explode states that we've already put in our timeline. So it's just going to overrule whatever this keyframe sequence is telling it. So make sure you don't select explode for this particular step. It's only the orientation that we're interested in. And then we'll put one last one in, maybe make this one a little bit different, maybe view it from one end, just for a little bit of variety. Now what you can do when you have these animations set up, if you're not happy with how these view orientations are allowing you to see your product, or maybe one of the views is pushing some of the components off the edge of the screen so you can't quite see them, then you can always come back in here and edit these views and resave them, and that tends to be how you work. You get the initial animation working, and then you might tweak the angles of the views a little bit and keep going round and round through iteration you end up with a more professional looking animation. So yeah, you sort of sketch it out first and then you fill in some of the details later. So I'm going to save this view again. I'm not interested in the explode state, I'm only interested in the orientation. Click on OK. So we've got 3 views that we're going to transition between. So let's activate the one that we're going to start on. You don't have to do this, but it seems sensible. So we're going to start on View 5. So let's close the View Manager down now. Get back into our Animations tab, so you can see that we were in the View tab there. The Animation tab is still active. We just have to click on it, or it's still visible. We just have to activate it. Now what are we going to do? We're going to use this option here. So View at Time. That is essentially what we're going to do next. We're going to transition from one view to another view, to another view, and to another view at specific times in our timeline of 30 seconds. So view at time. So what has it done initially? It's gone to one of the default views that all parts are created with. So it's gone to the back view. In our case, that's not the view that we said we wanted to select first in the animation. So I'm going to pick the one that we did say we wanted to select, which was that view 5. So that's where we want to start our animation. So at 0 seconds, that's what we want. So I'll add that into the timeline. You can see it's popped up there. Then I'm not entirely sure where I want to put the other views in the timeline. So I'm literally just going to drop them in anywhere at this point. And then what we can do is we can tweak the point at which each view occurs. So let's go view 6, which is the next one. Let's drop that in at, say, 10 seconds just to begin with. So we'll apply that. You can see view 6 has now appeared. And then eventually we want to go to view 7. So let's put view 7 in. Let's just drop that in at 20 seconds. And then again, apply. So you can see the 3 views has been entered in onto that view timeline. So I'm going to close this view at time window now. So close that down. Then I'm going to generate the frames for our 30 seconds. So generate the animation just so I can see what I've got at this point. Not because I think we've finished the view transition setup, but just because I know I'm going to have to make some changes to it. So I need to know what it looks like at the moment. So generate. It's telling me again, do I want to get rid of the temporary exploded state and the generated frames? Yeah, that's okay. So that initial view transition is okay, but then I think it goes too quickly to view 7. I'd like it to hold view 6 for a little bit longer than that. So the way that you would do that is you would make a duplicate of view 6 and maybe put it somewhere here. So it would hold that view 6 position for a period of time. So there's an easy way to do that, and the easiest way is to click on the little arrow that is view 6 in the timeline, right click and copy, and you can easily see that there's a copy of view 6 now underneath my pointer, and I can just drop that wherever I need it to be in the timeline. So there it is, view 6. Now if you want finer control over where these things are in the timeline, if you just double click on one of these arrows, let's say I don't want it at an odd in between 2 seconds on the timeline. Let's say I want to snap it to a whole second number, then maybe I would just type 14 in there. So yeah, the 2 options, you can either drag things or you can do it using number entry. So let's drag this view 7 to the end of the timeline, and let's do a regenerate now and see what we've got. So there we go, it's exploding, it pauses for a second, and then it rotates back round and comes back together. Now that's not too bad. Let's say I'm happy with that to a degree. So the last thing that we said that we might do is we might change the transparency or the opacity of some of the components so that you could see through certain components and see other components behind them if they were obscuring them. So you can see on the animation toolbar at the top there, we've just been using the view at time option. There's also a transparency at time. So you can define the transparency of certain components at specific time points in your sequence. So let's maybe run our sequence back a little bit. So if we click on that initial point that we come in at, so maybe between that view and that view, I'd like one of these components to start to become transparent. So transparency at time, it gives this transparency a default name. Now because I've set up some transparencies already in animation 1, I'm already on transparency number 6. But if you're just setting your animation up, yours will probably be number 1. So what are we going to do here? So you can see down at the bottom left, the system is trying to ask us a question here. It's saying select a part that you want this transparency to refer to. So let's select this case. So we'll select that part there. And if we hold down Control and select the other half of the case as well, we can do a bulk select. Then I'll click on OK because I've selected those. Then I can drag my transparency slider and you can see the parts getting increasingly transparent. So you're happy with their appearance. Let's say something like that. And then it's asking me for a time in my sequence that I want this transparency to occur. So I'd like it to be fully transparent to line up with these transition points here. So maybe around 10 seconds might be good. So 10, hit apply, and then for the time being, let's see how that has already affected our timeline. So let's close that dialog down. We'll do a regenerate. So you can see there that it harshly transitioned from being fully opaque to suddenly being transparent, and that's because we only have one keyframe defined there and it is fully transparent. So what we're going to have to do is put another keyframe in back at the start here, and maybe we can do that by taking a copy of this one and just modifying the transparency on it. So let's do a copy. Let's put that copy back at 0, and then let's double click on that copy and change it to fully opaque when it starts. So now what should happen is it should gradually transition from opaque to transparent over that time period. So let's see if it does actually do that. So yeah, it started off fully opaque, and then by that point it becomes fully transparent, and then because we've not told it to do anything else, it stays fully transparent till the end of the animation. So it might be nice to play with that transparency as the animation progresses. So let's keep it fully transparent. So I'm going to take another copy of this transparent version, maybe keep it transparent to somewhere out here, and then let's take another copy of that fully opaque version and put that right at the end of the animation there. So let's see how that's affected things by regenerating. So it transitions to semi-transparent. Now it should be coming back in again. Yes, and then it ends up fully opaque by the end of the animation. Now I would like it to stay as fully opaque for a little bit longer at the start of the animation there. So you can see it's opaque, opaque, then it transitions to semi-transparent. It stays the same transparency up to this point, and then it gradually comes back to opaque again. So that's pretty much all the setup steps that we need to achieve what we were looking at initially, which was that animation that explodes the part, it plays around with the transparency of some of the components, and it moves the orientation of the view itself. So when you get to that point and you've generated your final animation and you now want to save it out as some kind of MPEG or AVI file that you can then play back on a media player, the way that you would do that is you, instead of being in the create button here, so you're happy, you don't want to create any more data to put in your timeline, you want to go to the playback button, and what you get in there are these playback controls that should be reasonably familiar, and then you can do things like reversing the animation when it finishes. You can play around with the speed of the animation, you can jump forward frame by frame, you can advance the animation to the end or rewind it back to the start. But more than all this, there's a disk icon on the far left of the bar there. So if you click on that, what you can then do is save this animation out as an MPEG, for example. So the things that you've got to be aware of here are the aspect ratio of the screen that you're about to save is governed by the size of this animation window here. So you can see, hopefully, that the way I've got my system set up is not a standard 16 by 9 ratio. So 16 by 9 is the standard ratio for widescreen TVs or widescreen monitors, which in standard HD rather than Ultra HD is 1920 by 1080 pixels. And you can see here in this readout, if I put 1920 in for the width, the height isn't 1080. So my window is a little bit, it's not quite high enough for how wide it is. So maybe you would want to play around with that and try and hit the exact aspect ratio that you need. So 1920 by 1080, somewhere around there. You can play with this until you get it more or less perfect. Yeah, that's near enough. So yeah, that's how you set your resolution. You can then set the frame rate that you want to save this out at. I'm going to leave it at the default 25 frames a second, but you can save it in a higher frame rate if you want to. I'm not going to render these frames because I haven't done any setup in terms of the materials or the scene that this thing is sat in. So that would entail a little bit of setup time to actually make it look a little bit photorealistic. Whereas if I was to render it now, the effect wouldn't be that pleasing or that worthwhile. So I'm just going to do a screen capture essentially. How you see it on the screen here is how it's going to look in the animation, more or less. So if you want to browse to a specific folder, you can do that there. By default, this will be saved into your working directory folder, or whichever folder your animation has been loaded in from. So then you can change the name. I think I've got a few copies of this in there already, so maybe I'm going to call it number 5. So we'll click on OK, and then what it'll do is run through the animation in the background, and for every frame that you can see displayed on the screen, it's saving it to an animation file. In this case, it's an MPEG file, which isn't the most up-to-date animation format. MP4 files are more common these days, or 265, x265 encoded files, but you can always convert this to a more useful file format when you've saved it out as an MPEG. So I'm just going to pause it there so that we don't have to watch it do that entire sequence, and then we'll come back in and we'll look at the output file. So that saving operation has now finished, and we've got the MPEG file open in a media player here. So it's saved out at the resolution that we set, so it's a reasonably high resolution media file. So if I full screen it there, you can see we're not really getting any jagged edges or blockiness. So that's probably a good idea, which is the first thing. And then if we run this thing through, you can see the steps that we created being shown. Now if we had to critique this to go back in and improve it, you can see that these end pieces are going quite a long way off the edge of our frame that our camera is showing. So maybe we would want to go in and modify some of the views here, and maybe zoom the camera out slightly so that the entirety of our part stays within the bounds of the camera frame there. But essentially we've got all the steps and we've learnt all the tools that we need to then go on and refine that animation a little bit. So yeah, that's pretty much all the steps you need to know. One final thing that it's probably worth commenting on though is that when you close this animation down, so I click on close, you normally get a warning. Basically what this is saying is when we were in the Create tab, so when we were in the Create tab there and we were generating our animation, those intervening frames that it's generating every time that you do this, they are lost when you save your assembly file. Now, unless you have a specific need to keep them, you can always regenerate them the next time you load this assembly. So there's no real need to save those out. So if I've taken a save of the entire assembly just by the normal method up here, just click on save, then my animation that I've just created is safe there, and the next time I load this assembly up, I can come back into the animations tab and just regenerate that assembly or those assembly frames between my keyframe points. So that's okay. So what we're saying there is when we click on close, you can say don't save there, unless you have a specific need to want to save those intervening frames. So yeah, that's pretty much simple animations incorporating transparency changes, exploded views, and view orientation changes as well.